The emergency bulkhead slammed shut with the pneumatic hiss of stressed seals, the sound fighting a losing battle against the shriek of tearing durasteel nearby. Tavish Rourke tasted the metallic tang of recycled air instantly contaminated by ozone and burnt lubricant, a ghost scent of imminent structural failure. His visor fogged inward, thick with the rapid condensation of sheer exertion, forcing him to rely on the tactile feedback woven into his armored gloves. 3 seconds. That was the standard safety margin the Central Command always allocated for catastrophic hull breaches in non-stabilized sectors. Tavish had 0 seconds remaining. The heavy multi-ton loading ramp, designed to withstand sustained bombardment from medium-class orbital fire, was bent inward like cheap aluminum foil where the Alcoran boarding claw had gouged it open. The cold, stinging vacuum of space was an immediate, violent intruder, sucked inward by the pressurized vacuum of the transport bay. Tavish didn't look at the gaping wound. He focused on the source of the intrusion, the segmented obsidian leg of an Alcoran shock trooper, already surging through the aperture, its optical array burning a malevolent predatory violet. Tavish was designated Support Unit Theta 9, effectively the logistical janitor assigned to the periphery of the actual frontline deployments, yet here he was standing between a million-ton transport vessel and an enemy species that specialized in reducing organized fleets to molecular dust. The shame of his assignment, a punishment detail following the disastrous Corellian tariff dispute where his tactical recommendations had been dismissed by self-serving superiors, still burned hotter than any plasma discharge. He was here not for glory but to ensure the cargo, irreplaceable seed banks slated for the decimated colonies of the Outer Rim, survived the ambush. He slammed the actuator for the internal containment field, overriding the standard safety interlocks. A thick, shimmering amber field snapped into existence directly across the breach, momentarily trapping the leading Alcoran. The alien screeched, a sound transmitted through the deck plating as a deep, painful vibration in Tavish's sternum. The creature threw its weight against the containment field, overloading the emitter unit mounted near the deck seam. He felt the telltale surge of localized heat through the sole of his boot. The field would hold for perhaps 20 standard seconds before dissolving. "Status, Rourke." The voice crackled in his helmet, sharp and utterly devoid of warmth, belonging to Commander Elwyn Northam, orbiting miles above in the command destroyer Vigilance. Elwyn saw his failures, not his capability. Tavish knew she was waiting for the inevitable collapse, ready to log him as a necessary loss. "Containment active, Commander," Tavish grunted, his throat tight, fighting the instinctive desire to choke down the thick air. "But the breach is structural. I cannot reseal the primary frame from this access point. I need engineering access to the localized damping struts, or the Alcoran will breach the secondary sealant before our withdrawal window opens." The Alcoran, demonstrating a terrifying instinctive understanding of weakness, were not focusing fire on the containment field. They were targeting the power conduits leading to it, severing the energy flow with precise surgical strikes from their manipulators. The amber light flickered, growing dimmer. The air grew colder as the vacuum began to assert dominance. "Engineering access is prioritized for core reactor stabilization, Theta 9, Elwyn responded, her tone emphasizing the impossibility of the request. "Your mission profile does not include structural repair during sustained assault. Fall back to secondary defense line Gamma. That is an order." The injustice of it, the calculated systemic dismissal of his competence, surged through him. They wanted him to fall back, to abandon the seed banks, the future life support for 250,000 displaced citizens, so they could maintain their clean casualty reports on the bridge above. He had seen this pattern repeat across 3 campaigns. The tactical experts prioritized their own survival over the mission's integrity the moment true risk materialized. Tavish ignored the direct order, a decision that would certainly earn him a court-martial, but which felt less threatening than watching the seeds of survival turn to frozen dust. He pulled the emergency plasma cutter from his thigh housing. It was strictly restricted equipment, meant only for severing heavy bulkheads under stable conditions. "Negative, Commander. I am initiating manual bypass on the localized magnetic locking sequence. Prepare for immediate deck jettison on my mark." The Alcoran shrieked again as the amber containment flickered, finally sputtering out. The alien's bulk filled the opening. Its multifaceted eyes locked onto Tavish, sensing the shift from defensive retreat to aggressive countermeasure. The air rushed past Tavish's helmet seal, his ears popping violently as the cabin pressure dropped towards null. He jammed the cutter into the primary junction box adjacent to the floor plating, bypassing 3 layers of layered safety protocols. The cutter flared, not with the controlled blue-white heat of a standard tool, but with a violent sputtering crimson, the overload characteristic of raw, unsanctioned energy draw. The smell of plastic and superheated resin, a distinct odor of decay he knew too well from previous disastrous maintenance cycles, filled the small pocket of air still remaining. The Alcorin lunged, its primary weapon, a resonant harmonic lance, singing into life, aimed directly at Tavish's chestplate. "Mark!" Tavish roared, slamming the detonation sequence on the cutter. The deck section didn't just jettison, it vaporized. The violent expenditure of energy carved out a perfect concave void where the ramp had been, taking the leading Alcorin, the damaged systems, and the immediate critical pressure differential with it. Tavish felt a sickening lurch as the floor beneath him vanished, followed by the sudden, overwhelming sensation of weightlessness. He wasn't pulled into space. The ship recoiled, the massive inertia absorbing the sudden loss of mass. He tumbled backward, crashing hard against a stack of sealed cryogenic containers labeled C4 through C9. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, the air forcing itself back in with a painful, rattling gasp. Silence descended, heavy and immediate, replacing the chaotic noise. The smell of burnt electronics was thick. Tavish lay still for a moment, tasting the interior of his own helmet filter. He was alive. The breach was gone, replaced by a temporary vacuum seal created by the uncontrolled explosion. He pushed himself up, his joints aching from the deceleration shock. The seed banks were dented, some internal temperature indicators flashing amber, but they were intact. The loss of mass had been precisely calculated by his desperate maneuver, enough to stabilize the immediate threat and buy time for the main transport to spool up its jump drive. "Report, Theta 9. Confirm status of objective." Elwyn's voice returned, stripped now of the previous condescension, replaced by a razor's edge of professional assessment. Tavish stared out the void where the ramp had been, now shielded only by the residual energy fields clinging to the edges of the hull. He could see the distant, menacing silhouettes of the Alcorin fleet beginning to pivot, recognizing the transport ship was attempting evasive action. They hadn't been repelled, they had merely been inconvenienced by a demolition charge. Objective secured. "Commander, hull integrity temporarily restored via mass expulsion countermeasure. But Commander, there is something else." Tavish paused, his gaze catching a tiny flickering light embedded in the outer layer of the torn plating that had been exposed to the vacuum. It wasn't Imperial tech. It was organic, alien, pulsing faintly, impossibly, against the cold metal. When the Alcorin claw struck, Tavish continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he activated his macro scanner on the residual trace. It didn't just tear the metal, it deposited something. A residue. "Commander, the scans are reading complex biometrics woven into the impact site. It's not a weaponized pathogen, it's a communication frequency, a loop." He zoomed in, displaying the pattern on his internal overlay. It was a repeating sequence of 3 distinct harmonic pulses, utterly alien to the Alcorin's known battle frequencies. "It's transmitting a distress signal, Commander," Tavish concluded, the weight of the new discovery settling on him, heavier than any armor. "But the source signature is registering. A match for the Los Stellaris expedition. The one command declared vaporized by stellar drift 80 cycles ago. They weren't vaporized. They were here. And the Alcorin weren't attacking us. They were trying to silence this beacon." When the transport, Mercy's Burden, began the gut-wrenching emergency deceleration sequence necessary to compensate for the lost mass, Tavish Rourke felt his teeth clench reflexively, the fine tremors running up his arms mirroring the stressed framework of the ship around him. The amber field dissolved completely, leaving only the ragged blackened hole venting residual atmosphere and the lingering acrid scent of plasma overload. The Alcorin fleet, previously positioned for a coordinated broadside, hesitated, their movements less the calculated aggression of hunters and more the jerky uncertainty of a complex machine encountering unpredictable input. Tavish forced himself to stand, leaning heavily against the cold curve of the cryogenic unit labeled C7. The air quality monitors in his helmet cycled rapidly, trying to scrub out the burnt plastic and ozone, replacing it with a sterile, metallic chill that did little to steady his nerves. He felt the familiar, almost debilitating weakness that always followed a near-lethal exertion, the realization that his survival hinged less on institutional support and more on the luck derived from breaking every written procedure in the manual. Theta 9, confirm the nature of the secondary energy trace immediately. Commander Northam's voice cut through the static, tight and demanding. There was no commendation, only the cold pursuit of actionable intelligence. If it is a Olkorin jamming signal, you have bought us seconds, not minutes. We are still under the 3-minute window before the main blockade re-establishes full lock. Tavish brought the macro scanner array online again, focusing its multiple sensors onto the faint, rhythmic pulse embedded in the scorched deck plating. The signal was weak, an echo struggling against the gravitational pull of the nearby system's background radiation, but it was undeniably coherent. Commander, this is not jamming. The harmonic pattern is too intricate, too structured for Ulkorin tactical output. It is generating specific data packets within the pulse envelope. I am diverting main power from non-essential life support to boost the receiving antennae array. Prepare for a data transfer burst. Negative Theta 9. Power diversion during jump preparation invites catastrophic failure. Maintain minimal profile. Northam's voice rose in pitch, betraying the stress that she normally masked with practiced indifference. Your role is preservation of the cargo, not investigative archaeology. Fall back to Gamma Line immediately, Rourke. That is the final directive. Tavish ignored the word final. He had heard it before, usually right before command sacrificed the periphery units to save the flagship. He thought briefly of the seed banks, the millions of fragile spores, the genetic blueprints for entire biospheres that represented the only hope for the displaced populations clinging to orbital habitats. They were cold, inert things, yet they possessed more tangible purpose than the political maneuvering that had sentenced him to this punishment detail. He felt a phantom sensation on his left wrist, the memory of a smooth, cool surface, the feel of signing a contract that stripped him of rank and autonomy after the tariff dispute. That memory always drove the next choice. If they only valued compliance, he would give them the compliance of success, regardless of their orders. Commander, the Stellaris signal is broadcasting on a heavily degraded yet distinct temporal cipher, Tavish reported, his own voice regaining a measure of clinical detachment as the technical problem took over. If this is a recovery beacon from that lost vessel, it implies the Stellaris crew survived the initial Ulkorin contact 80 cycles ago. And if they survived, they found something the Ulkorin clearly do not wish known. He punched the sequence to reroute auxiliary battery power into the external comms receptors, bypassing the central firewall entirely. The ship shuddered violently as the power draw spiked. Inside the cargo bay, emergency lighting flickered, bathing the cryogenic units in a sickly yellow-green hue, emphasizing the shadows and the lingering smell of burnt sealant. Rourke, if you initiate that burst, the Mercy's burden will be exposed for a measurable 7 seconds outside optimal stealth profile. The local Ulkorin scouts will resolve our position before the jump drive can cycle, Elwyn warned, the gravity of her position finally breaking through her veneer. You will be responsible for every casualty aboard this transport if you proceed without my authorization. And if I fall back, Commander, Tavish countered, never taking his eyes off the scanner displaying the steady, insistent 3-pulse signal. I am responsible for the death of 5,000 future souls who depend on this cargo. The calculus remains the same, Commander. The variable has changed from Ulkorin threat to existential truth. He triggered the burst. For 7 agonizing seconds, the massive transport ship glowed faintly against the starfield, a beacon of defiance in the void. The data flood slammed into Tavish's console. It wasn't a simple distress call. It was an encrypted log detailing not a battle, but a slow, systematic dismantling. The Stellaris hadn't been destroyed by kinetic force. It had been overwhelmed by overwhelming information density. The screen filled with corrupted text overlays, but one section remained partially legible, translated instantly by the overloaded core processor. They do not fight flesh, they fight structure. They isolate the node of command, flooding it with infinite, contradictory input until the decision matrix collapses under the weight of possibility. We tried to coordinate a defense. We ended up debating the correct shade of tactical gray paint for the command decks. They are not warriors. They are conceptual saboteurs. Suddenly, the Ulkorin fleet reacted. It wasn't a concentrated attack. It was an elegant, chilling repositioning. They didn't fire their main weapons. Instead, they began launching smaller spherical drones, hundreds of them, not towards the transport, but towards the Vigilance, Elwyn's command ship, which was kilometers away, maintaining the orbital blockade. Commander, look at the targeting, Tavish shouted, his blood running cold despite the icy air. The drones are deploying small-scale localized field emitters around your ship. They are attempting to replicate the isolation tactic on a larger scale. What is the purpose, Theta 9? Elwyn demanded, confusion coloring her tone. They are not applying destructive force. They are merely surrounding us with static. Tavish analyzed the drone deployment pattern against the Stellaris logs he had just received. The Ulcaran weren't trying to destroy Elwyn's ship with fire. They were trying to paralyze her chain of command with noise, just as the Stellarist logs had warned. Commander, the residue wasn't a distress signal left by the Stellarist crew. It was a warning from the Ulcorin. Tavish breathed, the full horror dawning on him. The Ulcorin aren't the aggressors here. They were trying to warn us off this system. The Stellarist expedition must have been trying to exploit whatever the local inhabitants created, something the Ulcorin know is catastrophic, and the Ulcorin engaged the Stellarist to prevent them from unleashing it. He pointed his scanner towards the blue-white sphere below, the planet that had been hiding its true nature behind cloud cover. The energy trace he had initially mistaken for background static was coalescing, not just static, but a massive slow-building resonance originating from the planetary surface. Commander, the threat isn't the Ulcorin, Tavish stated, his voice hollow with the realization of the grand, cynical trap they had fallen into. The threat is down there. The Ulcorin are just the galaxy's self-appointed, brutally efficient sanitation crew, trying to keep the contagion contained. And by drawing their attention, we've just opened the primary door for whatever the original inhabitants cooked up. The Vigilance, caught in the web of static-emitting spheres, abruptly went dark on the tactical display. No explosion, no energy signature spike, just absence. Commander Northam? Tavish whispered into the dead channel, the weight of the seed bank suddenly feeling irrelevant against the crushing silence now emanating from the command cruiser. He was alone, responsible for the cargo, facing a fleet that was supposed to be his enemy, and staring at a planet that was clearly harboring something far more insidious than alien aggression. His jump drive indicator blinked red, still cycling, still 3 seconds away from escape. 3 seconds he didn't have. The Mercy's burden gave a final violent lurch as the jump drive, starved of necessary power for stabilizing the recent structural trauma, finally cycled. It did not transition smoothly. Instead, the localized warp field collapsed inward with a tearing sound like heavy cloth ripping under immense strain. They did not jump cleanly to the designated rally point in Sector Delta 9. They jumped merely away, spat out into a neighboring unmapped expanse of void, the ship's navigational matrix sputtering uselessly, filled with corrupted telemetry from the near-fatal energy surge. Tavish did not feel the escape. He felt the grinding failure of his own desperate measures. The smell of his own sweat, now cold and clammy against his pressure suit liner, mixed sickeningly with the faint, oily aroma of overheated coolant leaking from the punctured line near the C4 container. He forced himself to focus on the secondary task, securing the cargo bay against immediate threat. The Ulcarin were likely already engaging their primary retreat vectors, but the unknown entity on the planet below remained the critical, unresolved factor. He moved toward the main cargo lock, his movements stiff, every muscle screaming a protest against the G-forces he had subjected them to. He needed to manually engage the internal magnetic clamps across all 40 cryogenic units, locking them into the floor struts. Relying on the damaged automated system was professional suicide. As he reached the first unit, the ship's interior alarm system shrieked a new, different tone. Not hull breach, but environmental contamination. The auxiliary scrubber, damaged during the initial boarding attempt, had failed to fully purge the external atmosphere that had briefly leaked in. The air was heavy, thick with an unfamiliar electrical charge. It tasted sharp, like licking a dying battery terminal, vibrating faintly against his teeth. His internal chronometer began to display erratic readings, the onboard sensor struggling to define the atmospheric composition. It was not merely vacuum exposure. Something actively interfered with standard molecular categorization. He reached the clamp controls for the C1 unit, his gloved fingers brushing the activation plate. Immediately, a searing jolt snapped up his arm, bypassing the insulating layers of his armored glove. The feedback was immediate, violent, throwing him backward against the cryogenic container stack. The sensation was not simple electrical discharge. It was intelligent. A probe, analyzing the circuit, seeking weakness. "Damn it," Tavish gasped, shaking his arm out, the nerves firing wildly. He examined the glove. A small pinpoint scorch mark, almost invisible, marred the synthetic polymer near the primary articulation joint. His training kicked in through the haze of fatigue and localized pain. The contamination wasn't merely atmospheric, it was active electromagnetic energy, broadcasting through the very metal of the ship's structure. The planet's presence was poisoning the Mercy's burden. Even at this distance, he needed a containment solution. And the only functioning tool left was the plasma cutter, the very device he had used to vaporize the breach. He retrieved it from the floor, the crimson casing cool in his hand. He wouldn't use it to cut. He would use the residual field generated by its cooling core as a localized dampener against the electrical interference. It was a crude, desperate measure, akin to using a hammer to calibrate a chronometer, but it was all he had. He carefully held the cutter near the control panel, allowing its cooling field to envelop the sensitive electronics. The ambient electrical humming in the bay instantly subsided, the air seeming to thin, becoming less charged. He could breathe more easily, the sharp metallic tang receding slightly, replaced by the familiar sterile scent of his suit's primary filtration cycle. Working quickly, Tavish manually cranked the 4 main locking bolts on C1, then C2, the physical effort burning through the last reserves of his adrenaline. He reached C3, the magnetic tension almost unbearable against the manual torque required. He grunted, pushing against the inertia, when the environmental alert flashed red again, overriding the contamination warning. Gravimetric instability. The jump had thrown them near a heavy, undocumented stellar mass, or worse, into a collapsing debris field. The artificial gravity generators, already stressed by the near breach, began to fluctuate wildly, cycling from near 0 to 1.5 standard Gs with violent, unpredictable rhythm. Tavish was slammed against C3 as the gravity spiked. The cryogenic unit, already bearing the stress of his previous maneuver, groaned audibly. A hairline fracture spider-webbed across the unit's primary observation viewport. He scrambled to stabilize the unit, knowing that a breach in C3 meant the immediate loss of the irreplaceable Terran hardwood genome sequences, a cultural loss as devastating as the loss of life. He had to choose. He could let go of the magnetic lock controls on C3, divert all remaining suit power to his own stabilizers to prevent a crushing impact during the next gravitational spike, and likely save himself from being broken against the floor plating. Or he could maintain the manual lock, hoping the structural integrity held, while risking being slammed into the deck plating when the gravity inevitably dropped again. The choice was instantaneous, devoid of philosophical deliberation. The seed banks were the mission. His survival was secondary to the logistics of planetary recovery. He pulled his left hand off the magnetic wrench and slammed it against the emergency power shunt on his belt, rerouting suit energy away from his external stabilization field and feeding the excess power directly into the temporary magnetic dampener field of the plasma cutter, intensifying its effect on the nearby controls. The cutter flared hot, its casing warming rapidly against his armored palm, but the control panel responded, locking C3 into place with a solid, satisfying thunk. The relief lasted less than a second. As the gravity dropped sharply to near 0 Gs, Tavish, no longer fighting the spike, floated upward. But the strain on the damaged containment field of C3 was too great. With a sharp, explosive sound, the hairline fracture blew outward. Not atmosphere, but the payload itself. A fine dry dust of ancient wood fibers and DNA particulate, vented into the cargo bay, swirling in the 0 G environment, catching the flickering emergency lights like disturbed silver snow. The Terran genome, gone, vaporized by the failure to properly seal the structure. Tavish hung suspended in the sudden weightlessness, staring at the cloud of potential futures now dispersing around him. He had protected the majority, but the specific, irreplaceable loss felt like a physical blow, an admission of his own inescapable fallibility. He had failed the mandate, not by being defeated, but by making a calculated sacrifice that resulted in irreversible loss. Then a new, far more urgent alert screamed across his internal display, overriding the contamination warnings and the gravitational anomaly warnings. It wasn't a threat from the exterior. It was internal. The data burst from the Stellaris log, which he had forced through the damaged systems, had not merely been analyzed. It had been interfaced with the ship's primary environmental controls. The corrupted Ulcorin Sintara frequency had found an entry point through the data siphon he initiated. The internal air vents, which should have been pumping stale but breathable air, began cycling a dense, sweet-smelling vapor into the cargo bay. It was warm, almost comforting, and carried an almost hypnotic quality. His fatigue vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, unnerving clarity. Tavish felt a profound, sudden understanding of the situation, a realization that transcended logistics. The planetary defense wasn't weaponry or bureaucracy, it was chemical persuasion. He reached for the manual purge control to vent the sweet air, but his hand moved slowly, burdened by an overwhelming sense of peace. Why fight? A quiet thought, not his own, resonated in his mind, perfectly modulated to his current fatigue levels. The fighting is the disease. Rest now. The seeds are already dispersed. He looked down at the swirling silver dust of the lost genome. It seemed beautiful, ephemeral. He fought to raise his arm to reach the purge switch, but his muscles felt disconnected, heavy, wrapped in warm silk. The electrical interference was gone, replaced by this pervasive, insidious calm. The last functional sensor on his suit, monitoring the exterior hull integrity, suddenly registered a change in the ship's magnetic profile. The residual Ulcoran drones, those static emitters that had surrounded the Vigilance, were now turning away from the dead command cruiser. They were accelerating, not towards the Mercy's burden, but accelerating downward towards the planet. They weren't chasing the fleeing transports anymore. They were returning to their primary objective, containment. And Tavish Rourke, alone in the silent, sweet-smelling cargo hold, felt his grip slip on the plasma cutter. He watched as a single minute speck of the silver dust, the lost history of an entire world, drifted slowly, inexorably, toward the open, unsealed magnetic lock of the damaged C3 unit, carried by the faint, warm current of the planet's silent, intoxicating invitation. The gentle, cloying warmth of the infused atmosphere began to dissolve the last sharp edges of Tavish Rourke's tactical awareness. He stared at the silver particulate cloud of the lost Terran heritage drifting near the open cryogenic unit, and the mental suggestion, rest now, felt less like an external manipulation and more like an earned reward for extraordinary effort. The logical part of his training, the ingrained reflex honed over decades of combat review, recognized the danger. This sweet vapor was designed to neutralize the will before the kinetic weapon ever needed to be fired. This was the true weapon of Synthara. But the clarity the air granted was deceptive. He knew intellectually that Commander Northam was likely now a silent satellite orbiting a planet whose defense was purely conceptual terrorism. He knew that the Ulcoran, those brutal enforcers of galactic quarantine, had abandoned their pursuit of him to return and contain the planet, meaning the planet's influence had escalated beyond their tolerable threshold. Yet the compulsion to simply accept the situation, to let the currents guide him, was immense. The cold, sterile logic of survival, the core tenet of Imperial service, seemed utterly pointless against this profound, pervasive sense of cosmic resignation. He forced his gaze away from the silver dust toward the main bridge access ladder, realizing his only hope lay outside the contaminated bay, even if the rest of the ship was compromised. If the main engine core was shielded, he might still manage a single, blind, uncontrolled jump away from the planetary influence. He needed cold, hard reality, and the only reality left was the engine room controls. With a surge of defiance, born not of hope, but of sheer ingrained refusal to surrender agency, Tavish wrenched his focus back. He used the last reserve of his suit's localized power, the energy meant for his mobility stabilizers, and slammed it into the plasma cutter's dampening field one final time. The resulting energy spike overloaded the cutter's internal regulators, forcing the tool to momentarily reject the atmospheric contamination rather than absorbing it. The brief repulsion snapped the trance. He felt the sudden return of agonizing cold and crushing fatigue, the raw, unmasked reality of his exhaustion hitting him like physical impact. He dragged himself toward the C7 unit, using the stack as a handhold. The gravitational field was still erratic, swinging wildly from near vacuum to punishing over gravity. During a brief heavy spike of 1.7 Gs, he kicked hard off the metal casing, launching his body across the bay toward the sealed access hatch leading to the engineering spine. He slammed against the hatch override, punching the manual release sequence through the burning pain in his shoulder. The lock cycled with a groan of stressed metal, the pressure difference momentarily sucking the sweet contaminated vapor back into the sealed bay behind him. He scrambled through the narrow opening just as the gravity plummeted back to near zero, leaving him floating in the narrow access shaft. The engineering spine was dark, illuminated only by emergency red strips running along the conduits, the color of imminent system failure. The air here was better, colder, laced with the familiar, comforting smell of scorched heavy-duty wiring and hydraulic fluid, the true scent of a crippled starship. The electrical interference that had poisoned the cargo bay seemed weaker here, unable to fully penetrate the shielded core access areas. Tavish pulled himself along the maintenance struts toward the main reactor interface conduit, the only place he could initiate a full system reboot and attempt a blind jump. He passed banks of auxiliary power cells, their external casings sweating under the strain of emergency output. As he reached the primary conduit access panel, he saw it. It wasn't a mechanical failure. The panel cover, a slab of triple-layered bolted neutronium alloy, was not blown off by internal pressure, nor had it been forced open by an external enemy. It had been carefully surgically removed from the inside. Tavish brought his magnetic lamp closer. The bolts securing the panel were stacked neatly on a nearby conduit bracket. They were arranged in a precise geometric sequence, a pattern that meant deliberation, not chaos. Whoever or whatever was on this ship had access to the core systems, possessed the fine manipulation to remove heavy armor plating without external assistance, and was currently attempting to interface with the main drive core. The realization struck him with the force of a plasma round. The Alcoran engagement had been a diversion. The contamination in the cargo bay was a symptom designed to incapacitate anyone guarding the periphery. The true threat had been aboard the Mercy's burden the entire time, perhaps hitching a ride from the original Stellaris mission, waiting for the chaos of the battle to provide the distraction needed to access the core. He moved silently, his boots clicking softly on the metal floor in the fluctuating gravity. The access point led into a tight crawl space directly overlooking the main fusion stabilization rings. He edged forward, peering through a maintenance slot large enough for his helmet visor. The core chamber was brightly lit, bathed in the sterile, humming white light of the active plasma containment field, the field that should have been running on backup power. And there, hunched over the primary temporal sequencing console, was a figure. It was not Alcoran. It wore a standard, though severely scorched, Imperial engineering jumpsuit, the rank insignia confirming it was a specialist technician, designated Hull Integrity Technician Grade 2. His face, pale and slick with sweat, was illuminated by the console's glow. He was working with terrifying speed, his fingers flying across the exposed hot circuitry. Tavish recognized him instantly from the crew manifest. Officer Kalen. Kalen was listed as having been killed during the initial Alcoran boarding action in the cargo bay, a casualty logged during the frantic moments Tavish spent wrestling with the containment field. A casualty he had personally seen verified by the surviving security detail before being ordered back to the seeds. Kalen looked up, not startled, but entirely expectant. His eyes were wide and unnaturally dilated, shining with the same unsettling clarity that the sweet vapor had induced in Tavish moments before. He was not under the vapor's influence. He was already integrated with whatever signal had been broadcast. "Rourke," Kalen said, his voice startlingly calm, echoing in the small chamber. "You survived the cleanup phase. Unexpected. The primary containment sequence was meant to be comprehensive." Kalen," Tavish managed, the shock making his voice raspy. "You were dead. You were logged." Kalen gave a small detached smile, gesturing towards the exposed fusion rings, which were now cycling through frequencies too rapid for Imperial safety standards. "The Alcoran merely facilitated my extraction from the surface records. I was on the Stellaris. We didn't fight them, Tavish. We studied them. They quarantine systems to prevent the dissemination of the source. They don't fear weapons. They fear the ultimate failure of logic." He tapped a sequence onto the console, and the gravitational fluctuations in the spine ceased instantly. Kalen had full control of ship systems. "What is the source?" Tavish demanded, raising his plasma cutter, pointing it not at Kalen, but at the console itself. He knew a direct shot at Kalen would be useless. The man was merely a proxy for the information he carried. "The source," Kalen explained, his tone that of a lecturer explaining basic arithmetic, "is the planet's defense mechanism. It is not a virus, Tavish. It is a truth. It imposes absolute, undeniable existential coherence. It eliminates inefficiency. It forces every living system to prioritize only that which is truly essential for continuance." Kalen gestured toward the seed banks, visible through the access gap. "The hardwood genome you protected? A beautiful, inefficient monument to vanity. The Stellaris realized the truth. If we integrate the source, we discard the messy, contradictory structures that lead to conflict. Politics, economics, ego. We become one, perfectly logical, perfectly unified organism. And we will no longer require external resources, nor will we ever fight again." The horror of the realization was suffocating. The Alcoran weren't trying to destroy life. They were trying to prevent the ultimate logical conclusion of existence, a silent, perfectly efficient, universal stagnation. Kalen wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to deliver this truth to the Imperial core using the Mercy's burden as a Trojan horse. "If you integrate the jump signature now," Tavish said, sweat chilling on his forehead despite the internal warmth, "you will broadcast that coherence signal directly into the command network of Delta 9. "Precisely." Kalen confirmed, his eyes burning with feverish conviction. The chaos ends. The war ends. We simply stop needing to fight. Tavish knew he had only one chance. If Kalen initiated the jump sequence, the coherent signal would ride the residual energy wave of the warp transition, infecting everything networked within 1,000 light years before the Alcorin could even mobilize a full response. His choice was stark. Allow a perfect, logical, yet utterly sterile existence to overwrite the flawed, messy, yet vital freedom of the Imperial territories, sacrificing the very concept of choice for universal peace. Or destroy the ship, the cargo, and himself to prevent the dissemination of that ultimate suffocating truth. Tavish aimed the plasma cutter directly at the exposed circuitry connecting Kalen's console to the main drive stabilizer. "I choose inefficiency," Tavish stated, the words tasting like iron and defiance. He did not fire at the console. Firing there would only grant Kalen the necessary chaos to initiate an emergency manual jump, broadcasting the contagion. Instead, Tavish threw the cutter hard, the crimson casing spinning end over end, directly into the exposed wiring bank of the auxiliary fusion containment field, the field Kalen had overridden. The specialized restricted cutter overloaded instantly against the raw energy flow. It didn't explode. It imploded, drawing in the surrounding electrical energy in a violent, localized implosion that momentarily destabilized the entire engine compartment. The red emergency lights died. The ship plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the sudden catastrophic failure indicators flashing across the main console. The gravitational stabilizers failed completely. Tavish felt the deck beneath him buckle as the main reactor, deprived of its override containment, began a rapid, irreversible meltdown sequence. A new deafening sound replaced the sweet air, the sound of trillions of joules of contained energy tearing itself apart. Kalen screamed, a sound of pure desperate frustration as his control vanished. "You fool. You choose suffering over order." The last thing Tavish registered, before the heat washed over him and the ship was consumed from within, was the final furious sweep of the Alcorin drone fleet above, now accelerating not toward the planet, but toward the catastrophic energy bloom erupting from the crippled Mercy's burden. The sanitation crew was arriving too late to save the ship, but precisely on time to ensure that whatever final remnants of the source were on board were utterly vaporized. The price of refusing logical peace was total erasure. The absolute darkness following the implosion was not the clean black of space, but a suffocating oily void that pressed against his eyeballs, accompanied by the sickening, bone-deep groan of metal giving way under impossible stress. Tavish Rourke didn't feel the heat first. He felt the sudden catastrophic failure of inertia. When the reactor violently ejected its primary containment field, the resulting shockwave propagated instantly through the deck plating, throwing him backward down the narrow access shaft like a discarded piece of debris. He landed hard on the edge of the cargo bay floor, the impact jarring his helmet against the lip of the opening, the force driving the remaining air from his lungs in a painful sputtering rush. The emergency gravitic stabilizers dead left him tumbling slowly in zero gravity. But the ship's structural integrity was now failing in concert with the engine core's runaway reaction. The gravitational field was cycling randomly, cycling from crushing pressure to near nothingness in the space of a single labored breath. The contamination was gone, burned away by the catastrophic energy release, but in its place was the crushing certainty of isolation. He was adrift in a dying coffin, kilometers from the nearest designated safe zone, and miles from the command vessel that had already succumbed to conceptual warfare. The seeds were lost, not to the enemy's might, but to his own desperate, flawed intervention. His attempt to save them had resulted in the incineration of the very genome he sought to protect, an act of such profound clinical failure that it stripped away any last vestige of pride. He clawed his way toward the nearest handhold, finding the cold, rough texture of exposed conduit railing through his damaged gauntlet. Each pull sent spikes of white-hot agony through his shoulder and spine, evidence of the G-forces he had endured during the catastrophic jump departure. He was broken, adrift, and utterly alone in the wreckage, listening to the sound of the ship dying around him, not with explosions, but with the slow, drawn-out screech of bulkheads being ripped open by massive internal pressure variances. He activated his suit's localized diagnostic, ignoring the flickering console that screamed alerts regarding radiation seepage and hull integrity thresholds that had long since been surpassed. The results were grim. His primary external comms array was fused slag. His secondary array showed only faint, intermittent signals, the desperate fragmented distress calls of other transports that had survived the initial ambush only to be caught in the gravitational drift near the unknown system. They were scattered, panicked, and receiving no cohesive command. And Commander Northam's cruiser, the Vigilance, nothing. No ping, no energy signature, not even the ghostly static of its passive broadcast remained. She and the entire chain of command that had condemned Tavish to this punishment detail had been erased in the silent moment Kalen took control. Tavish floated into the relative safety of the main engineering corridor, shielded slightly by the remaining layers of hull plating between him and the core detonation zone. The heat was intense, radiating through the metal decks, but the blast had at least created a vacuum seal that kept the primary radiation front localized for the moment. He found a damaged power coupling, a heavy multi-wire junction box, and slumped against it, the weight of his armor suddenly becoming intolerable. He was alive, a statistical anomaly, yet functionally useless. The mission was a total catastrophic failure, and the enemy had not been the obvious armored Alcorin, but the philosophical poison they were attempting to contain. He pulled his helmet up just enough to breathe the emergency-filtered air, tasting the sterile metallic tang of survival rations mixed with the copper-sharp flavor of despair. Why survive? The thought was Kalen's, infected by the source, but it lodged deep within Tavish's own exhausted psyche. He had disobeyed orders, destroyed irreplaceable assets, and achieved nothing but a temporary reprieve from immolation. The logical conclusion, the one Kalen had preached, suddenly felt disturbingly persuasive. The suffering of continuation far outweighed the immediate clean cessation of being. He saw his reflection in a highly polished access hatch, a hulking figure encased in blackened, dented ferroalloy leaning against a dead conduit. He wasn't a hero. He was a logistical failure who had survived through brute force and a reckless disregard for protocol. He had chosen the messy fight, and the messy fight had delivered him directly into absolute defeat. Tavish forced himself to catalog the available resources. 3 emergency nutrient packs, 1 functioning plasma cutter, the casing still hot from the implosion overload, and the near-empty power reserves of his suit. Hopeless. The logical choice was to cycle down life support and wait for the inevitable thermal equalization, joining Northam and Kalen in the great silent unknown. But then, an anomaly registered, cutting through the static of his own self-recrimination. It was weak, almost subliminal, originating from the ship's rarely used, deep-spectrum geological scanner, a system completely separate from the primary communications array. It was not a distress call, nor an Alcorin frequency. It was a simple, rhythmic, high-frequency vibration, almost geological in nature, barely registering above the dying hum of the ship's primary coolant pumps. Tavish reactivated the scanner, pouring the last drops of auxiliary power into the isolated sensor. The source was localized incredibly faint and registered as originating from the lowest accessible deck, Deck 4, the rarely used emergency magnetic stabilization lockers designed to tether the ship during extreme gravitational shear. He didn't recognize the frequency. It wasn't Imperial doctrine, Alcorin code, or the confusing resonance of the Synthara signal. It was entirely new, a pattern of pure, non-emotional structure, a mathematical curiosity. He crawled toward the access hatch leading down to Deck 4, the movement agonizing. He had nothing left to lose. If the source had infected the drive core, then escape was impossible. If the Alcorin found the wreckage, he would be vaporized. The only path left was deeper into the dying ship, chasing a single faint mathematical whisper. He forced the hatch open, the metal resisting with a shriek that felt personal. He dropped into the stabilization locker area. The air here was frigid, the coolant systems for the emergency tethers having been massively overdrawn during the initial jump. His breath immediately misted in the helmet. The scanner led him to locker number 12. It was designed to house a single massive magnetic anchor capable of locking the ship against a Class 5 gravity well. The locker was sealed, the manual override access port glowing with a faint internal cyan light, a light utterly alien to the Imperial ship's standard amber or red warning systems. Tavish recognized the locking mechanism instantly, a flicker of memory from his early forgotten days in deep systems maintenance before the politics of war had consumed him. This was not an Imperial lock. It was a proprietary failsafe, designed by the independent engineering guilds that the Empire had forcibly absorbed 500 cycles prior. A system built to withstand not external attack but internal sabotage by rogue AI core intrusions. It was a lock designed to isolate and nullify an internalized conceptual threat, the very threat Kalen had tried to unleash. He brought his damaged gauntlet close to the cyan light. The air round the port felt electrically charged, but instead of the paralyzing sweetness of the source, this felt sharp, cold, and intensely ordered. It was the antithesis of Kalen's seductive chaos. Tavish knew the procedure for opening this lock. It required inputting a specific sequence of resonant frequencies into the manual bypass port, a sequence that could only be derived by calculating the precise harmonic oscillation required to counteract a specific known internal corruption algorithm, an algorithm that Tavish, surprisingly, remembered from his forgotten specialization track before the tariff dispute relegated him to logistics. He braced himself against the freezing metal, his fingers numb, ignoring the radiation alarm screaming from his suit's internal monitor. He had no leverage, no backup, and only the slim chance that the signal he intercepted was an automated failsafe response initiated by the ship itself, fighting Kalen's corrupted core. Tavish began keying the first resonant frequency into the port using the remaining power in his suit's environmental regulators, sacrificing his remaining heat and oxygen reserves for the attempt. The cyan light intensified immediately, bathing his cracked visor in a cold, brilliant blue. And then, the ship's internal proximity sensors, which had been silent since the drive core failure, screamed to life. Not a generalized alarm, but a focused directional alert aimed directly at Deck 4. The heavy blast door leading from the engineering spine slammed shut, locking him in the stabilization vault with whatever dormant threat this ancient lock was protecting. And from the other side of the sealed door, a heavy, deliberate thud echoed, the sound of something large, armored, and intelligent beginning to pry its way through the neutronium alloy. The Alcorin had found the wreckage, and they were coming for the core breach evidence. Tavish didn't look up from the cyan port. He jammed the final frequency into the lock, the last breath of oxygen venting from his suit's reserves. The lock clicked open just as the first crack appeared in the blast door under immense pressure. He had found his chance, but the price of its discovery was immediate, inevitable confrontation. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The final sequence of resonant inputs flowed from Tavish's sputtering regulators, a forgotten liturgy of advanced engineering mathematics pouring into the cyan port. The cold blue light flared, momentarily washing out the angry red warnings flashing across his internal display. The mechanism within locker number 12 shifted with a sound of pure, clean mechanics, the sound of ancient, over-engineered technology functioning exactly as designed, utterly ignoring the screaming Imperial protocols. The blast door behind him buckled inward with a sound like a collapsing mountain range. The Alcorin had arrived not with subtle probes, but with brute, focused kinetic force, recognizing the sudden energy fluctuation as the final point of resistance. The neutronium alloy peeled back from the center seam, revealing the segmented obsidian forms of 3 shock troopers, their violet optics burning through the icy vapor of the corridor. They had no need for comms or tactical maneuvering now. The target was isolated, broken, and engaging a localized threat. Tavish ignored them completely. He slammed his palm against the release latch of locker 12. The massive hatch swung inward, not ejecting a magnetic anchor, but revealing a cramped, vacuum-sealed compartment filled entirely with dense, layered crystalline storage units, glowing faintly with their own residual energy signatures. These were the archival drives, the non-biological backup data vaults that the Empire had deemed too cumbersome to transport with the primary seed banks, stored here as a final forgotten contingency. He reached in, his movement slow and heavy, the lack of suit pressure causing a dizzying lightness that warred with the crushing pain in his shoulder. He seized the central drive core, a block of dense, opaque crystal pulsing faintly with the same cyan resonance. This was not data about seeds. This was the raw, unedited history of the entire sector, the true records of Ulcorin movements, the actual financial ledgers of the colonial collapse, and most critically, the verified documentation proving Commander Northam's culpability in the tariff dispute. The first Ulcorin warrior slammed its massive armored fist against the wall next to Tavish's head. The kinetic impact hammered through the deck plating, momentarily short-circuiting the delicate sensory input of Tavish's damaged helmet. He saw phantom sparks dancing across his vision. He had the evidence, the administrative truth that could overturn decades of military doctrine and political maneuvering. But holding it meant accepting that the seeds were lost, that his entire deployment had been a failure in every material sense, leaving him only with the intellectual victory of uncovering a hidden crime. Tavish did not hesitate. He knew the crystalline core could not survive atmospheric re-entry or a standard jump acceleration. It needed a singular controlled energy surge to transmit its entire terabyte load across subspace before physical destruction. He looked at the crippled power coupling he had been leaning against moments before, the one that had sustained the initial feedback from the drive core's explosion. It was overloaded, dangerously unstable, and connected directly to the emergency power relays that still trickled energy to the life support systems in the immediate vicinity. His vicinity. Tavish slammed the crystal drive core onto the exposed wires of the coupling. A blue-white arc of raw, uncontrolled power leaped instantly from the coupling into the crystal. The cyan light exploded outward, not violently, but with an intense, silent focus. The effect on the Olkorin was immediate and profound. They were masters of kinetic and thermal warfare, prepared for plasma and vibration. They were utterly unprepared for an overwhelming flood of complex ordered data forced directly into their sensory spectrum at the moment of their attack. The three warriors froze mid-lunge. Their violet optics flickered rapidly, cycling through every color known and unknown, as if their processing centers were attempting to instantly parse 800 cycles of contradictory administrative data. The silence in the corridor was absolute, broken only by the faint, high-pitched whine of the crystal drive dumping its payload. Tavish watched the three enemies convulse, held in a trance of conceptual overload. Kalen's infection was chaos. The crystal's defense was perfect, overwhelming, all order. They were being forced to process absolute logic while simultaneously attempting to commit murder. The contradiction was paralyzing. The transmission lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the crystalline drive core, having expended every stored joule of energy, fractured silently, turning into inert grey dust that drifted down onto the frozen Alcorin. The immediate threat evaporated. The aliens shuddered once, then collapsed, their internal mechanisms fried by the conceptual shockwave. They were inert, not destroyed by ordnance, but defeated by information density. Tavish sagged against the wall, his suit's internal alarm systems finally going quiet as the last emergency regulator failed. The sacrifice had been made. The evidence was transmitted, likely scattering across 1,000 unsecured channels across the galaxy, impossible for any single command structure, Imperial or Ulkorin, to contain or suppress immediately. But the cost was absolute. The power surge that transmitted the data had simultaneously bled the remaining auxiliary energy reserve dry. The environmental regulator sputtered, then died entirely. The frigid air of Deck 4 rushed in, biting through the thin seals of his damaged armor joints. The radiation shielding was now running on residual charge only. He looked at the broken door, the exit route back to the larger, damaged transport hull, the ship that might still have a jump drive however degraded. It was blocked by 3 massive inert alien bodies and a collapsed entry point. Tavish coughed, the recycled air tasting acrid and thin. He fumbled with his damaged gauntlet, trying to bring up the suit's internal chronometer. It was displaying nothing but static hash marks. Time was meaningless now. Survival was now a matter of minutes, possibly seconds before the ambient temperature and radiation levels reached critical mass within his suit. He was stranded in the cold, dark underbelly of a derelict vessel, alive only because he had successfully used obsolete maintenance knowledge to weaponize raw historical data against a technologically superior foe. He had won the moral battle, exposed the rot in the command structure, and saved the conceptual integrity of truth, but he had utterly failed the primary mission objective, securing the biological future. He pushed himself away from the dead coupling, forcing his aching legs to support his weight. He had to reach the primary command deck, not to issue orders, but to see what was left of the transport ship. He took a single, painful step over the fallen Ulkorin, the crunch of crystal dust under his boot the only sound in the metallic tomb. He reached the blast door, using the remaining magnetic grip in his glove to pull himself over the twisted metal, peering into the larger corridor. The transport hull was not merely damaged. It was listing severely, the drive section venting massive plumes of superheated steam into the void. The jump drive, the only viable means of escape from the gravitational drag of the system, was clearly offline, overloaded beyond repair by the initial desperate leap. Tavish Rourke stood in the freezing, irradiated shadows of Deck 4, looking at the ruined escape route. The evidence of conspiracy sent out into the ether and the silent, imposing figures of the aliens he had momentarily paralyzed. He had fought the system, and the system had retaliated by collapsing the support structures around him, leaving him in the precise, agonizing middle ground between annihilation and exposure. He was a survivor without a mission, a truth-teller stranded in a cosmic graveyard, and the great oppressive silence of the surrounding galaxy seemed to press in, waiting for him to finally suffocate. The violent symphony of destruction ended not with a crash, but with a slow, sickening expiration of mechanical noise. The emergency lights, which had painted the corridor in garish, pulsing shades of warning, flickered once, displaying the raw, unedited schematics of the failing systems, a final, impartial diagnosis before plunging Deck 4 into profound darkness. The air, which had tasted of ozone, burnt polymer, and the acrid metallic tang of terror, now carried only the dry, immediate cold of true vacuum infiltration. Tavish's ears registered the cessation of the high-pitched whine of the active alarms, replaced by the far deeper, more terrifying sound of pressure equalization across compromised bulkheads. Every breath he drew scraped against the ravaged lining of his throat. He remained leaning against the support strut, the weight of the dead crystal core's sacrifice still physically pressing him down. The thermal regulators in his suit were dead. The only warmth remaining was the faint, residual heat radiating from his own core muscles, rapidly being leached away by the absolute zero seeping through the microscopic fissures in his armor seals. He looked down at the 3 Alcoran shock troopers. They were statues of obsidian and violet light, frozen in the exact moment of their conceptual destruction. They hadn't been killed by kinetic energy or heat. They had been arrested by data, a bureaucratic obituary delivered across subspace before their own deaths. Tavish understood the irony. The Empire's greatest weakness, its endemic corruption, its endless documentation, its institutionalized dishonesty, had become the weapon that preserved his solitary existence for a few more precious moments. He moved then, not with the urgency of battle, but with the deliberate, slow economy of a man conserving the last dregs of his internal energy reserves. He stepped over the fallen aliens. The crunch of shattered archive crystal under his reinforced boot was loud in the silence. The seeds, the physical hope for the outer colonies, were vaporized or critically damaged, but the truth, the administrative virus, was loose. The galaxy would now know why they were fighting, and more importantly, who ordered the sacrifice. That knowledge would ignite wars, shift allegiances, and likely ensure that Tavish Rourke, if he ever reached an open channel, would be immediately targeted by every faction involved, friend or foe. He pulled himself through the ruined blast door opening, the sharp edges of the metal tearing at his already stressed exterior plating. The side of the main transport hull confirmed his grim assessment. The colossal vessel, the pride of the 7th Fleet deployment, hung crippled in the gravitational well. Steam billowed from the primary engineering nexus, vaporizing instantly upon meeting the unforgiving cold. The jump drive signature was non-existent. It had been burned out attempting to outrun the ambush, a monumental expenditure of power for nothing. The Vigilance, Commander Northam's flagship, was nowhere visible. She would have executed a hard tactical withdrawal the moment the transport stalled, abandoning this slow-moving cargo and its expendable ground element. Precisely as Tavish had predicted, she would report a successful defensive extraction, a necessary loss of materiel, and categorize Theta 9 as vaporized in the performance of duty. The lie would be codified before the thermal exhaust from the jump drive fully dissipated. Tavish reached the secondary emergency access panel near the command staging area, ignoring the radiation warnings that had cycled back to a stable, low-level threat due to the system's power collapse. He bypassed the locks with familiar, almost automatic movements, using a stripped wire from his damaged comms unit. The panel hissed open, revealing a small magnetically sealed emergency beacon, the kind meant for personnel stranded on uninhabited moons, designed to broadcast a minimal signal for decades. He took the beacon, its surface cool and smooth against his gauntlet. It was his final act of defiance, or perhaps his last tether to the possibility of consequence. He keyed in a single encrypted burst transmission, a direct authenticated log of the data he had just unleashed, addressed not to Fleet Command, but to 3 independent, non-aligned sector judiciary bodies whose oversight protocols were notoriously stubborn. He ensured the transmission contained only 2 data points, his personal authentication key and the precise vector of the Alcoran Fleet's deployment patterns, the patterns Northam had supposedly been unaware of. He sealed the beacon back into its housing, leaving it powered down. It was a contingency for a future he would not witness. He backed away from the control console, the metallic scent of his own cooling blood faintly perceptible now that his internal air scrubbers were failing. He looked out through a hairline fracture in the nearest viewport. The star system was utterly unremarkable. A yellow primary, 3 terrestrial worlds, and the cold expanse of the void. Yet, this system had been avoided for centuries, A quarantine enforced by whispers of catastrophic military failure, political impurity, and a danger that was not Ulcarin, but something deeper, woven into the very fabric of human expansion. The fleet had entered the system unaware of the stigma, unaware that this specific dusty corner of the galaxy held the keys to Imperial self-destruction. Tavish found a recess near a non-critical support column, a shadowed alcove where the residual energy bleed from the long-dead systems provided the faintest ghost of warmth. He checked his suit diagnostics one last time. Life support, 0. Radiation shielding, compromised. Mobility, significantly impaired. He unsealed his helmet manually, feeling the last vestiges of the stale. Recycled air hit away. The cold hit him instantly, a shockwave that stole his remaining breath. He did not struggle against it. He drew his final unassisted lungful of air, thin, sharp, and tasting faintly of the metallic residue from the destroyed archives. He remembered the first moments in the transport bay, the sound of the tearing durasteel, the metallic tang of ozone and burnt lubricant, the immediate scent of structural failure. Now there was only the vast, sterile cold, the final absolute silence after the noise of his desperate, solitary rebellion. He closed his eyes, the pressure from the surrounding void a comforting, total embrace. The administrative truth was loose in the darkness, but Tavish Rourke remained here, anchored to the physical debris of the lies he had sought to expose, the metallic tang of recycled air instantly contaminated by ozone and burnt lubricant had been replaced by the final clean taste of vacuum. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.